Okay, let's unpack this. When we look back at the Roman Empire, it's so easy to search for that one single moment, the date the whole thing fell.
Right, the decisive crisis.
Exactly. But for someone living inside the city walls or, trying to manage a farm out in the provinces, it wasn't like an earthquake. It was more like 1,000 tiny tremors happening every day for generations.
Hmm.
So today, we're diving into the sources to ask, what did it actually feel like to live through that? When long-term instability just becomes normal, this is a deep dive into habituation, not collapse.
And if you wanted a daily, palpable reminder that things were changing, you just had to look at the money in your hand.
Ah, the currency.
The economic situation was probably the most pervasive sign of that systemic stress. We can trace the debasement of the silver coin, the denarius, all the way back to emperors like Nero.
So this was happening for a very long time.
A very long time, they were consistently reducing the silver content, putting in cheaper metals, which meant the coins in your pocket were physically lighter, less trustworthy year after year.
That's critical, isn't it? It's not a sudden shock. It's a slow erosion of trust. And you, the listener, would literally feel the difference in weight between your coins and the ones your father used 20 years before.
Exactly. That physical difference is huge. But the hyperinflationary crisis kicks off much later. The state gets desperate. It needs to pay the legions.
Always the legions.
Always. And so they just start assigning new, higher face values to these worse and worse coins. Values that had, absolutely no connection to the metal in them. The government was just trying to manipulate its way out of debt.
And what did that do to the average person? The merchant, the farmer? What's the consequence on the ground?
The entire economy had to adapt. People just shifted. They moved away from cash. Barter becomes much more common. And then, and this is crucial, the state itself starts demanding taxes in kind.
In goods, not money.
In wheat, in oil, whatever. Think about what the state is admitting when it does that. It's saying, we no longer trust our own currency enough to collect taxes in it. You might still see the legions march by, but when the tax collector shows up and demands sacks of grain instead of coins, you know something fundamental has changed. And what's so fascinating is that despite all this, disease, constant warfare, climate shifts stretching the empire's structures to their limit, the psychological expectation of continuity was just immense.
People just assumed Rome would go on forever.
The sources really suggest that. The idea that Rome would not endure was almost unimaginable to the people living through it. They saw these things as problems to be solved, not the end.
So that belief in permanence lets them categorize everything as a temporary setback. But the symbols of power, they had to change, right? You can't keep projecting the image of a simple civic leader when the reality is so much harsher.
No, you can't. And the imperial presentation, it adapts to normalize all this change. You can see it so clearly in the famous portraits of the four tetrarchs from around 300 CE.
They're so different from earlier statues.
Totally different. Earlier portraits emphasize, wisdom, civic virtue. The tetrarchs are these monolithic figures. They're in full military armor, clutching swords. They have these stern, almost identical faces, and they're wearing obvious crowns.
It's a very clear message.
It is. Military necessity and open regal power, that became the new normal for leadership. The emperor wasn't the first citizen anymore. He was the ultimate general.
And that stubborn belief in permanence, it carried on even with the people who were, actually dismantling the Western Empire. Historians like Guy Halsall point this out. These Gothic or Vandal generals, they weren't always trying to destroy the empire.
Not at all. Many of them were deeply committed to the idea of Rome. They were just acting to improve their own position within the system, a system they couldn't imagine ending. They were carving out administrative zones, not trying to plant foreign flags. So if the first part is about this psychological habit of stability, the next is about how that instability becomes an administrative reality, when emergency fixes are put in place and then they just never go away.
And life gets heavier, more bureaucratic.
Exactly. And the most dramatic example of this comes right after the crisis of the 3rd century. Think about it. 20 different emperors in just 50 years. It's pure chaos.
So Diocletian's solution was just pragmatic desperation.
It was. His reforms create the tetrarchy. You have 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, and 2 junior ones, the Caesars. It's a military and administrative fix. The goal is stability, a rapid response on the frontiers.
But it was meant to be temporary.
Well, it set a template for a much more complex, less centralized system, and it ended up, fundamentally redefining how the empire was governed, and eventually it just led to a permanent split.
But that bureaucratic burden, it didn't just stay at the top, did it? The sources show this. quiet collapse of civic duty among the local elites.
Indeed, in the 4th century, you start seeing laws that are explicitly designed to force the landowning classes, the curials, to do their local government jobs.
Jobs they used to compete for.
Viciously. Collecting taxes, maintaining infrastructure. That used to be the path to power, the cursus honorum. But now, the state's financial problems meant these duties were financially ruinous.
So they had to be forced to do them.
Forced, yeah. Sometimes with threats of imprisonment or having their property confiscated, and that's a huge sign of the system's health. When the local aristocracy is actively avoiding power, you know the system is hemorrhaging confidence from the inside.
So if the state is forcing its own local leaders into service, who's actually looking after the basic utilities? The infrastructure.
Well, that's where you really feel it. The state is so desperate for revenue that everything goes to defense. Building and garrisoning Hadrian's Wall, for example, costs a fortune.
And things like aqueducts and sewers.
They become a secondary goal, often just ignored. And that's the key to the lived experience. The world doesn't end in fire and thunder. The public bathhouse just closes. Not because of a barbarian invasion, but because the lead pipes haven't been replaced in 50 years.
A slow, sad contraction of civic life.
Exactly. And if you connect this sort of slow decay to the bigger picture, you realize that different generations were living through completely different versions of what Roman life even was. The Roman identity was always incredibly adaptive.
You see that so early on with the demographic changes. Emperors and senators, they stop being just Italian. They're from Spain, from North Africa, from regions near modern Germany. And that's as early as the 2nd century.
And that fusion just accelerates. Eventually, you get so-called barbarian generals right at the heart of the Roman military. You have someone like Stilicho. He was of Vandal origin, but he was a powerful general, fiercely loyal to the Roman state.
And then you contrast him with someone like Alaric.
Right. The Visigoth who sacked Rome in 410, but he wasn't really a foreign invader trying to destroy everything. He was a Roman commander demanding recognition, supplies, a seat at the table. It was a very violent negotiation for resources within the system.
So for the next generation, their heroes might actually have Vandal heritage. It changes what Roman even means.
It totally does. And you see that reality filter down into daily life, into communication.
How so?
Well, the elites are still studying classical Latin, of course.
Yeah.
But along the frontiers, you suddenly need to know languages like German for basic commerce, for daily interaction. We see it in the letters of people like Sidonius Apollinaris. It's just a new practical necessity.
And there's an even more subtle shift happening, right? In the materials people are using to write.
Yes, and this is fascinating. Starting in the 4th century, you see this very distinct transition away from using papyrus scrolls.
Which is cheap and plentiful.
Exactly. And they start using the much more expensive and durable parchment codex, basically the book format we use today.
Wait, that's a huge insight. Why does that switch from papyrus to parchment matter so much?
Because papyrus was mass-produced in Egypt. It was perfect for high-volume, disposable things, administrative records, letters. Parchment, which comes from animal hides, is costly, it's labor-intensive, but it can last for centuries.
So the shift means
It signals that recording and preserving things is becoming a much costlier, more selective process. You're prioritizing long-term storage of vital texts, legal codes, religious documents, over the kind of ephemeral mass communication you see in a healthy, large-scale bureaucracy. Communication itself was getting more expensive.
So how do people cope when things are clearly deteriorating, but there's no single final end? The sources seem to show this mix of just extreme pragmatism and total resignation.
They do, especially among the wealthy. There's this chilling, cynical decadence. Take the account of Senator Vetranio, a 5th century patrician.
What did he do?
Well, the story goes that while facing a siege and famine, he hosted what he called the banquet of famine for his friends. They just consumed the most lavish, excessive food until they were physically sick. It's this perverse choice self-destruction through excess, because that was better than enduring the indignity of scarcity.
A kind of theatrical resignation.
That's a perfect way to put it. But that atmosphere of decadence existed right alongside the state's almost dogged attempts to keep things running.
To maintain administrative coherence.
Precisely. The state was still trying to govern, to regulate. Just look at the Theodosian Code, compiled in the early 5th century. It's this massive, comprehensive legal project.
Which seems incredible for a system that's supposedly falling apart.
It shows the persistence of the idea of Roman administration. They were so intent on maintaining law and order that they codified centuries of legal rulings, creating a template that actually survived into the early medieval era. The bureaucracy was outliving the military structures it was built to serve.
So the fall wasn't a single death blow at all. If the administration is still coding laws and the political fragmentation is often managed by treaty, it's more like a slow internal rearrangement.
That's the key takeaway. In the West, it was often a violent but still managed domino effect. Groups like the Goths established their kingdoms by treaty with what was left of imperial authority. They took over territories and administrative roles. They didn't just burn everything down.
So it's a transformation.
It's a gradual, often violent transformation into what we call medieval societies. And that's why it was so hard to recognize the end, let alone pinpoint it. And that complexity it's really underscored by archaeology. You can't just declare a disaster if the local economy wasn't completely dead. In fact, in a lot of regions, the total rural output, the gross imperial product, you could call it, was actually higher in the late Roman period than people used to assume.
So it wasn't a simple story of economic collapse.
No, the economy was adapting, it was localizing, it complicates any straightforward narrative.
So what does a powerful state look like when it's still operating, but it's literally cannibalizing its own past to survive?
It looks like the Arch of Constantine, which was put up in 315 CE. It's a huge, powerful monument, and it's a famous example of spoliage.
Which is reusing materials.
Deliberately repurposing symbolic architectural pieces from older structures. The arch has sculpted panels and medallions that were just pulled off monuments built by earlier emperors like Trajan and Hadrian.
And this wasn't necessarily just laziness or a lack of skill, was it?
No, probably not. It signals an empire that was still powerful enough to build massive projects, but was consciously dismantling its past to construct its present. It's a deeply symbolic act recycling history itself. Maybe the skills had diminished, or maybe it was a deliberate political statement, a way of appropriating the legitimacy of past greatness to prop up the current ruler.
So the Western political state fragments, but the core ideas of Roman life, they don't just vanish. What are the essential structures that actually survived all this?
A tremendous amount survived, and that proves that Roman continuity existed even when the centralized state didn't. Things like the sophisticated law code, the very definition of citizenship, that idea of having special protection under the law, that followed people into the new Germanic kingdoms.
And even smaller things.
Even smaller things. We still use the calendar that Julius Caesar established. And deeply rooted customs like certain wedding rituals, they persisted. The cultural infrastructure of daily life just carried on, even after the imperial legions stopped marching.
And that, is the profound insight here. The Roman people's great capacity for adaptation, for habituation, it allowed them to treat this profound systemic deterioration, the lighter coin, the tax payment in grain, the crumbling aqueduct as just background noise. This ability to normalize dangerous change, to treat an existential threat as just another manageable problem, is what allowed the entire transformation to feel normal, even as the structures around them were quietly failing.